Hello, I'm Dave Miller. It's Think Out Loud. We're coming to you today in front of a City Club audience at the Governor Hotel. We are here to talk about a new statewide survey of Oregonians' values and beliefs. It was conducted for OPB, the Oregon Health and Science University, Oregon State University, and the Oregon Community Foundation. It's the third values and beliefs survey conducted since 1992, so we can really start to see some patterns in public opinion, and there is a ton of data to chart. Thousands of Oregonians were asked almost 200 questions about everything from education and healthcare to taxes, public safety, and the environment. When you put it all together, it's basically a statewide map of what Oregonians care about right now and our hopes and our fears for the future. We're going to dig into the results today with folks here at the City Club of Portland and our radio audience. We want to know what your assessment is of how we're doing as a state. What are you optimistic about, and what are you pessimistic about? Where do you think we're falling short? Our website, opb.org/thinkoutloud. Our phone number is 1-888-665-5865. Adam Davis joins me now, the founder and principal of DHM Research. Great to have you here.
Well, thank you, Dave.
So, as I said, we're going to get to some of the results. So we're going to dig deep into what you learned. But before we get to that, this is so big, I thought we could start with some background. What is this survey?
What is the survey? Well, the survey is an in-depth look at the full public opinion spectrum in Oregon. We worked very hard to be sure that we get a complete picture of public opinion in Oregon. Just not how registered voters feel, even though we can break them out. Just not how people who have the time and are inclined to go to public hearings and attend community and neighborhood meetings, and just not the people who are at the polarized ends of the opinion spectrum, but the full opinion spectrum. So that's what distinguishes this study from other studies. It's of the full opinion spectrum. And I do want to thank Oregon Health and Science University, Oregon Community Foundation, Oregon State University, and Oregon Public Broadcasting for making this examination of the full public opinion spectrum possible.
How did this build on the surveys you did in 1992 and in 2002?
The 1992 and 2002 studies were similar to the 2013 study in that we were really out to find out how people feel about the key issues of today. The issues that are facing our communities, the issues that are facing our state, indeed our nation. So they'd had that in common. I would say the 2013 study is basically looking at more issues. There was probably more focus in 1992 on economic development, and in 2002 on taxation, specifically tax reform.
And here we have, as you're saying, a broader look, more questions about more different kinds of topics.
Absolutely, and you touched on some of those, not just health and healthcare and education, but we looked at everything from the economy and jobs to the environment, even at religion and spirituality and land use, things like that.
Does that have to do with who's actually paying for this? My understanding is that it was business groups largely in 1992. It was a combination of business groups and labor in 2002, which didn't come together for this particular survey. And then, as we heard, the consortium now, that's media, healthcare, education, and a larger community foundation.
These organizations have a broad mission. These organizations are focused on a number of initiatives, statewide and locally. And their initiatives touch on all these different topics that we asked Oregonians about. They came to this study really with no agenda. It was really, again, to learn what that full opinion spectrum is about here in Oregon.
How did you actually do it? As I mentioned, we're talking about, I think, 4,000 or so individual Oregonians total, and almost 200 questions. When I go through the questions, it's overwhelming. So you call somebody up and say, do you have an hour to answer 200 questions?
And you know what they'd say to us, Dave?
Yeah, my values and my beliefs are that my time is more important than yours.
Exactly. Actually, over 9,000 Oregonians participated in the 2013 Oregon Values and Beliefs Study. There were two tracks. One was a scientific track, and the other was a public involvement, civic engagement track. The scientific track consisted of 3 surveys that were scientifically designed and administered. So in effect, you were able to cover more questions, right, by having 3 surveys. You're absolutely right. There's no way we could have had someone sit through 200 questions. Now, I want to stress something, Dave, that we took great pains to make sure that this was a representative sample. And we wanted, again, for it to reflect that full public opinion spectrum in Oregon. So setting up demographic quotas, using statistical weighting, we were able to assure that this sample was representative. Another thing that makes this study unique, Dave, is that using sampling techniques, scientific sampling techniques, and doing enough interviews, we are able to say not only how Oregonians in the valley or in the metro area feel about things, but how Oregonians across the state feel. So we've got some good regional data that is statistically reliable for a subgroup analysis, which is unusual for opinion research in Oregon.
So let's turn to what you actually learned. One of the big headlines, it seemed, was a lack of faith in the ability of government to actually accomplish things. What exactly did Oregonians tell you?
Dave, you're right. 200 questions, hundreds and hundreds of pages of crosstabs. And I asked myself last night, if you had to boil it down to 3 takeaways, what would those takeaways be? Takeaway number 1, for me, being the project director, was that it regards the urban and rural divide that we all hear about. And quite frankly, the data shows us that it is not as deep and not as broad as maybe a lot of people think it is. We Oregonians value the same things about living in the state. We value the same public services. We even feel the same about how inefficient government is and how wasteful government is. We feel the tax system needs to be reformed, that it's unfair. We have
all
those
of that
things
was
in
consistent
common.
across the Cascades.
Across the Cascades. Now, there are differences, don't get me wrong, but so often those differences are not that large, okay? The second big takeaway for me is the negativity towards government. Now, that is broad, and that is deep. And we had, the questionnaire included some open-ended questions, and my staff will tell you that I'm a stickler when it comes to open-ended questions. They're more expensive, but their value is incredible. But you have to take the time with them. You have to look at the words, the imagery that people are using. So we got an idea of what they were thinking when they told us how they feel about government and politicians.
So what are the words that stood out to you?
Getting nothing done. Take a look at what's going on in Washington, D.C., right? The other one is just waste, inefficiency. These are the things we heard from people over and over again. Those were the reasons why people feel so negative about government. Now, those were the real big ones for me. The third one gets to what you were saying, Dave. It's discouraging to me as an Oregonian, lifelong Oregonian, to see how many people feel we will not come together and overcome our differences and make significant progress on the issues facing this state over the next 10 years. Everyone agrees we need to do it, but man, oh man, they're telling you they're not very optimistic that we can do it.
If you're just joining us, I'm talking right now with Adam Davis. He's a founder and principal of DHM Research. We're talking about the results of a major statewide survey that looked into Oregonians' political, environmental, and social values. Over 200 questions, thousands of Oregonians. If you want to join the conversation yourself, add your voice to this mix. 1-888-665-5865, our website, opb.org/thinkoutloud. as you're talking there about this widespread sense among Oregonians that politicians just aren't going to get something done, it's impossible this week not to think about what politicians are, more than half of them, are very proud about this week in Salem. The grand bargain, so-called grand bargain, that I assume many of our listeners have heard about, maybe more times than they wish to even to think about right now. How do you think the folks who responded to the survey, i.e. Oregonians, view what happened in Salem this week?
Honestly, Dave?
Yeah, it's funny that you would even ask that, but yes, honestly, and then we can all start lying.
Many Oregonians don't even know it happened, okay? Many of them are not not privy to the details of the grand bargain. There would be a lot of cynicism and skepticism around it. I think it's an incredible accomplishment. I think it ran beautifully contrary to what you're seeing in Washington, D.C. Our legislature coming together with the governor to make significant progress on things that we know are of concern to Oregonians. But again, it relates to two broader issues that I want to touch on very quickly. Because whenever you have survey findings like these, you've got to think of context. What's the overall context? What are the possible explanations for these findings? And one thing we have to appreciate that people's awareness and knowledge levels of the ABCs of government and of how our public finance system works is extremely low. It's extremely low. And this is a real big problem. The other thing is how fragmented media is these days. There was a time when you could impact public opinion. For example, what happened this week by just making sure there was good coverage in the Oregonian. Do you know that the Oregonian was not being delivered to most of the people's homes who had delivery the morning after that deal was struck? There was no coverage of it. So
there was online coverage.
There was online coverage.
And there was radio coverage and TV coverage, but in this particular example, yes, there was not 7 days a week delivery.
And I'm just getting to the point that we've got some challenges moving forward, and that's to look at the fragmentation of media right now, the low awareness and knowledge levels of the ABCs of government and public finance, and it's just real hard to make progress right now with public opinion.
I'd love to hear from folks here in the audience. You all have some questionnaires, a very mini version of the huge survey that was done by DHM at your tables. And one of the very first question is basically how you'd rate your feelings about Oregon right now. I thought we could just do this by applause. So it's basically very positive to very negative. Starting first, who circled 1 or 2, meaning very or somewhat positive about your take on Oregon right now? Applause. All right. What about number 3, people who are in the middle? All right. And 4 or 5, negative, very or somewhat negative. All right. So clearly overwhelmingly positive, a smattering of undecideds, and a slightly larger than small smattering of negative. How does that compare to statewide?
I give all of you an A+. You guys were right on. The public... Really, here it is. You want the numbers, everyone? 40% very positive. Write that one down. 40% very positive, 37% somewhat positive. Okay? And we have 9% neither positive nor negative, 8% somewhat negative, 3% somewhat negative, 1% don't know. How did you do? Okay, right?
So that's overall numbers, but when you dig down, if people are negative, or even if they have an overall positive attitude about themselves, what are they pessimistic about?
Again, Dave, let's just go back to the results of that one question that we will really be able to pull together and overcome the critical issues facing the state. They're concerned about population growth and the impact it's going to have on the things that they greatly value about Oregon. You know something, Dave?
Can I ask you a question?
Sure,
is that constant? Yeah. I mean, it's something that we remember from decades ago. Come here, but don't stay. Has that basically held constant? a fear of population growth, a fear of Californians, a fear of Oregon getting too big.
Oregonians do not want to lose what they value about living in this state. And Dave, what they value is the natural beauty of the state. They value the clean air and the clean water. They value the outdoor recreation opportunities, both the variety and how close they are to the coast, to the mountains, to the gorge, to the wine country, to the high desert. They value those things, so they look and they're concerned about population growth. They're quite frankly concerned about economic development because they do not want those things threatened.
You mentioned economic development. 57% of respondents said that protection of the environment should be given more priority, even at the risk of slowing economic growth. So a majority, not a huge majority, but a majority of Oregonians. Where do you see that geographically? I mean, is that relatively constant across the state, or are there differences there?
There are some differences, but not major differences. If you move into the more rural areas of the state where the economy is particularly bad, you're going to see more people in the economy camp around that question. But I would encourage everyone to visit the website www.truenorthoregon and check out those findings. So yes, in Eastern Oregon, more people in the economic camp, but I think you will be surprised to look at the findings overall by region. And Dave, let me add one other thing. We worked real hard in this question to get at key issues using more than one question format and different wording for the question. It's called triangulation. So the questionnaire was triangulated to try to get at this issue. So when you ask people, for example, about climate change, boy, that's one I would like to ask this audience about. In fact, I do, don't I? But what they tell us is that they feel that we need to change our lifestyles to address climate change.
The numbers were really stark to me. You gave respondents two choices about climate change. Here's one. It requires us to change our way of life, such as driving less or living more simply. Or, if climate change becomes a problem, we can deal with it later. And changing the way of life, this is across all Oregonians, it was chosen 3-1. Would you have guessed that?
No, that's one of my surprises. We're out there all the time monitoring public opinion, but this climate change issue has, in our opinion, it continues to ripen here. And what's amazing is to look at how people feel about this across the state. But stop, Portlanders, ask yourself, if you're a rancher dealing with drought in Eastern Oregon, if you aren't scratching your head, wondering if maybe, just maybe, there's something with this climate change thing. The other question that I thought was real interesting was, again, getting back to triangulation, getting a little bit at this same issue, was the support for this question. Our country would be better off if we all consumed less. So that's that validation I'm talking about. Okay, we have to change our lifestyle to address climate change, but also our country would be better off if we all consumed less.
Let's take a call from Emil in Vancouver. Emil, welcome to the show. It's good to hear from Washington in this. We've already said Oregon, I think, about 50 times so far, so welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
My question is, will you this morning on the show address the perspectives of minority populations such as Latinos, African Americans, and Asians, and give us some sense of how those attitudes relate to the attitudes of the majority population in the state?
Emil, thanks very much for that question.
That's a great question, and I want everyone to know that we've just begun our work, Dave. Again, just an amazing amount of information to get through. So we're going to be doing deeper dives into some of the subgroups. I'm interested in communities of color, but quite frankly, I'm also interested in how maybe 12 to 17-year-olds are feeling about issue. How not only 55-plus people might distinguish themselves from other folks, but how 65 to 74, 75 plus. There's a lot of subgroup analysis to do.
So you're saying that you have the data, it's in the Excel spreadsheet somewhere, but you haven't crunched it all yet, made all those crosstabs.
Yes, and I want to do more with communities of color. Here's where our sample split. You're talking about latest census information, about 83 percent white. Our sample was at about 88%. So I would like to extend a willingness to the communities of color here on this side of the river and on the other side of the river to work with them to learn more about their particular populations.
We have to take a quick break, but in about a minute, we're going to find out what Oregonians had to say about education and healthcare. Stay tuned. You're listening to Think Out Loud on OPB. I'm Dave Miller. We're coming to you from the Governor Hotel. This is the Friday Forum for the City Club of Portland. We are talking today about the results of a major new statewide survey. It was conducted for OPB, OHSU, OSU, and OCF, that's the Oregon Community Foundation. DHM Research conducted the survey. I've been talking with Adam Davis from DHM. He is still here. We're going to turn now to some of the highlights from the survey. Oregonians' views on education and on healthcare. Bobby Regan is here, Secretary-Treasurer of the Oregon School Boards Association, a longtime advocate for Portland Public Schools. And John McConnell as well, the Director of the Center for Health Systems Effectiveness at Oregon Health and Science University. John, we'll hear from you in just a second. But Bobby, first, starting with education, what stood out to you? What was your headline for the education survey?
I think the headline for me and the excitement for me was the fact that Oregonians have such a high value on education, K-12 education in particular, and then community college and access to higher education. One of the things that really stood out to me was, I think what Rob Manning at OPB talked about as a pessimism gap that exists, which is people have high expectations for what they want in education, and yet there's this gap in what they expect. And
in other words, a gap in what they expect will actually happen.
Yes.
That they don't, I mean, which maybe goes back to what we heard earlier from Adam, that they don't necessarily think that, that districts or the state as a whole are going to deliver on what they want. Why do you think that is?
Well, what I thought about was 10 years ago when this survey happened, I think Oregonians had a right to be pessimistic. So in 2002, we were coming off of 9/11. There was huge economic issues that were happening. School districts across Oregon were cutting. Portland Public Schools, for an example, was being lampooned by Doonesbury comic strip nationally because we were cutting 25 days off the school calendar. The city and the county essentially took over teacher contract negotiations. As a result, they contributed something like $15 million to keep our doors open. Teachers agreed to work 10 days without any pay during that 25-day period. When you look at that, you can see that there would have been huge reason for pessimism. At the same time, this group called HOPE emerged, and instead of just lying down and taking it, this group, Help Out Publication, ended up being thousands and thousands of parents who took to the streets and got bridge funding in the form of the Multnomah County income tax. So you look at the pessimism from 10 years ago and our reaction to it, and then this pessimism gap today. So today, if you look at what happened in the last legislative session, our legislators devoted another $1 billion toward education in the last legislative session. On Wednesday in the special session, they devoted another $100 million. We have a levy in Portland, we have a school bond, we have an art tax, we have a children's levy. There's so many things that tell us that we are on the cusp of turning the corner.
You're talking here about major infusions of money that will start to bring school funding back to where it used to be in some sense. But I imagine that some of the respondents they're looking at dismal high school graduation rates and falling test scores and fears about what the Common Core will bring. How do you deal with those? I mean, and setting aside questions of increased state funding.
Well, I think I will get to that in one second. I think in terms of the pessimism, part of what I think is still with us is that we've had 20 years of school funding cuts since Measure 5. we're coming out of a miserable recession that has just clobbered the poor and the middle class. We have national leaders who are not doing their job, and people don't differentiate between political leaders. You have your national leaders who are messing up. All political leaders are messing up in most people's minds. It seems to be the case. And we also have the impact of social media, which I think is a really interesting piece when it comes to what's happening in this country, because it used to be if somebody was disgruntled about something, they could write a letter or pick up the phone. Today, you have somebody who's disgruntled, and they blast an email out to 50 people, they blast it out to 50 more. Before you know it, you have a petition drive going, then you have a social Facebook page going. And what started out as, a person with a legitimate gripe ends up almost feeling like a movement. And so one of the things I was going to suggest, Adam, is at some point we should be tracking what's happening with social media, because you have the opportunity for people to be anonymously mean-spirited and mean and inflammatory. And I think that adds to some of our pessimism. There's some wonderful things about social media also, of course, but it's an interesting new dynamic that we have in the equation.
I understand we have a question about education from Andrew, who's called in from Portland. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Yeah, hi, thank you for taking my call. Well, I grew up in Gresham. My girlfriend grew up in Eugene. We are both products of the public education system. And, when I was going through school, I really noticed that from the time that I was in kindergarten to when I graduated high school, things were really going downhill. And I was in music in high school. I played the trumpet and I was in marching band. And by the time that I was leaving, the funding was really going downhill. And I only see that really has been getting worse and worse for arts. And I just wanted to kind of see what the general feeling was in Oregon on the funding for public education, and especially on arts and music and things like that, because I think those are such essential things for child's development, and it really helps. I know it helped me overall in my education. So, yeah, that's my question.
Andrew, thanks very much for that question. Bobby, one thing that stood out to me, and I don't remember if there was a specific question about arts or music or those kinds of aspects of education that increasingly are rare, but two things that people said that they wanted more of in the K-12 system is civics and financial education.
Yes.
But when you looked at the numbers, did you see that significant numbers of Oregonians did want art and music to return?
Adam, you might want to answer that one.
Dave, we did see support for expanded programming. And you're right, money management was something that they wanted to see more of. But life lessons in terms of how to be effective at the workplace, being better equipped to deal with family. And I use this word very, very carefully, everyone, and it's called values. And let me put quotes around it. But those kind of values, we hear a lot about class size. We hear a lot about teacher assessments, but there are other things on the minds of Oregonians. One thing you haven't mentioned, Dave, is the role of parents. And you saw in the results, really wanting to see parents step more up to the plate.
It was a stark number. 90% of Oregonians believe that parents should take greater responsibility and be more involved in their children's learning. Mm-hmm. Bobby, from what you see, the implication is that Oregonians think that parents aren't doing enough right now. Do you think that that's true?
It's actually an area that I'd love to talk about, because I think we have to define what parent engagement means today, because it's different than 30 or 40 years ago. Parent engagement used to be you were on the PTA and you did bake sales for extras. Parent engagement today is so different, in part because of what's happened to our economy. So to me, incredible parent engagement is the fact that you have two working parents, often working 2 or 3 jobs, trying to put a roof over a kid's head and food on the table. I'm sorry, but that is incredible parent engagement. You have parents who are able to help with homework. Yes, they're not at the PTA meeting, but they're helping their kids with homeworks. You have parents who are waking up their kids and getting them to school every day. You have parents who are participating in parent conferences and participating in different ways than we used to see, like emailing with their teachers. And so one of the other things that we're seeing is that we as school districts have to change how we do parent engagement too, because our populations are different. And so, for example, Portland Public Schools, we contract with a lot of communities of color and agencies that support communities of color, because that's where many parent populations feel the safest. And so we go to them, or we try to go to them. We have many parents who are emerging bilingual. We have to change the way we have to provide translation services. We're trying to start more language immersion schools. And by the way, when you start a language immersion school, not only are the kids becoming bilingual, but you're also providing opportunities for the parents to be able to participate in the school because they can help their children with their homework because it's in their language. The one area where I felt a real incapacity to help my children is when they were taking Spanish. I don't know Spanish. And so I feel for parents as they're trying to figure out how to engage, and we have to figure out how to be more welcoming and make that happen.
If you're just tuning in, we're talking right now about this major new survey that was put out by a number of groups, including OPB. We're going to turn now to healthcare. If you have questions about how Oregonians value healthcare, or you want to share your own thoughts about the future of healthcare here in Oregon, give us a call, 1-888-665-5865, or if you're here at the Governor Hotel, you can make your way on over to the mic. John McConnell is here, as I mentioned, Director of the Center for Health Systems Effectiveness at OHSU. What are your headlines for what Oregonians had to say about healthcare?
Well, I think the thing that stood out or was highlighted the most was a strong interest among Oregonians in really supporting or incentivizing people to have healthy behaviors and not wanting to pay for simply more medical treatment.
But if I may, it wasn't just incentivize. Well, the flip side of incentivizing healthy behavior is penalizing unhealthy behavior.
Right.
And a big majority of Oregonians said that people should pay more if they smoke, if they drink a lot, if they don't exercise.
Yeah, so let me comment on that one. That one, I think, so they're a little bit separate. In terms of sort of making people pay higher premiums for addiction, that's a tricky road to go down. And if it's obesity, beer, cigarettes, a lot of economists would favor higher taxes on things like those. So if we want to do a beer tax, we can talk about that. A higher premium is a pretty indirect connection. And one thing that's pretty clear from the evidence is people with addiction disorders, you don't want to make it harder for them to get treatment. So you don't want to attach more stigma than already exists. You really want to treat it like a disease and not a personal problem. And if you increase the cost or decrease access to those treatments, outcomes are not good, and they spill out beyond healthcare into sort of livability and crime and other things like that.
One of the numbers that stood out to me was that across the state, people seem to be largely satisfied with the care they're getting, with the primary care, with various specialty care. If the average person is satisfied, and I'm assuming we're talking about people who have access to healthcare, so, but still, it's a big majority of Oregonians who were surveyed who said they like what they're getting right now. If that's the case, what does that mean for any even minor effort to change the system?
Well, it's a good start. I think there's a lot of variability there. It varies depending on what kind of insurance you have. I think there are disparities among communities of color. So there is no doubt that as you look and dig into the healthcare system, that there's a lot of room for improvement. I think access is one issue. We need to think carefully about how it changes as we go forward. But a fundamental challenge for us as Oregonians and as a country, and I don't want to make myself sound too important here, but we have to figure out a sustainable way to finance the healthcare system, and so we have to make some changes. If we don't, access to education, taxes, the government, all the things that we do value, they're going to be harder to pay for if we don't figure out how to solve the healthcare problem.
In every part of the state, except for Eastern Oregon, people said that they wanted publicly funded universal health care. Would you have guessed that the numbers would be that strong in favor of universal health care, publicly funded?
No, that was a surprise.
Why?
Well, I guess I don't see it reflected in maybe it's in the sort of the people that I talk to, but also you just don't see a lot of movement in that area either across the country or across the state. So I know there have been some efforts sort of in Oregon to try to introduce things like those, but I've never had the sense that they have a lot of legs.
One of the interesting the follow-up questions to that, though, was people were asked about rationing. They were asked specifically if they wanted a scientifically and ethically based cost-benefit analysis to be used to ration publicly funded medical procedures for a socially fair distribution of services. Adam, I can see why this took a while. That's just one question. And Oregon's were basically split. It was about 50%, which in some ways is a surprisingly high number of people saying, yes, we want rationing, often seen as a very dirty or a very scary word.
Right. So I think Oregon has a sort of a lead on understanding this, and it's a nuanced area. You know, it's a dirty word in a lot of places, but I think what Oregonians have come to understand through, you know, a long history of looking at this is that rationing is happening whether you do it explicitly or implicitly, and so I think there's sort of, you know, maybe a little bit more comfort around this. You know, the good news is that we don't necessarily have to ration care. There's a lot of inefficiency there and a lot of waste, and we can do a lot better than we are currently doing without getting strictly to rationing.
You know, Dave, one of the things I'm just impressed with here is how this information really touches on something what I said earlier, and that is the low awareness and knowledge of government and public finance. And it's this kind of information that our two guests have shared, which if Oregonians and our friends on the other side of the river in Washington heard these comments, it would definitely have an impact on how they feel about the issues. Dave, I want to make one other, a couple things about both issues. On education, in addition to K through 12 being considered to be very important, community colleges and the universities also considered to be very important as well.
Very important, but a lower priority for the vast majority of respondents than K-12 was.
And the issues are real clear, aren't they? One is access and the cost of tuition. That is the issue for college and the universities. And the other, and we saw this throughout the survey, is how much Oregonians value workforce development, how they value vocational and education training. And those college and university courses that deal with engineering and technical training, highly rated. So I don't want us to not touch on those important services as well, but you're absolutely right. K through 12 is king. And when you spend time with Oregonians, the focus now really, and I've watched this develop over the years, is really zeroing in on K through 3. Pre-K, still a little problematic, but K through 3, the real focus on the part of the concern about education is at that level.
We got a question for you from our website. Rising GR says, how much do you think that the opinions of Oregonians are influenced by the media and conventional wisdom? He says, I was thinking specifically about the inefficiency and duplication of government.
Well, the media, and of course I'm not including OPB in this, I never would, Dave.
Oh, we can take our lumps.
Going to take the medicine? You know, the focus is it seems to always be on the sensational and the negative, and this has an impact on public opinion. The trivialization also is just amazing to me. So many people have just literally tuned out coverage of national affairs, what's going on in state government and local government. It's just out of sight, out of mind now. That's how disgusted they are with things.
Bobby and John, I'm curious what you wish had been asked. If you could do this again, and if you want to add one more question to the almost 200, John, what would you want to know? What are some of your burning questions about Oregonians' feelings about healthcare?
You're asking me first, huh? So let's see. I think, what do I want to know about healthcare? I think I want to know something about the trade-offs people are willing to make to get at a better healthcare system. So the questions we asked were about values, but they are not the ones that are really going to give us the levers to slow healthcare spending. And so we have to figure out some way to do that. And so I would want to know more about where people sort of, can give a little bit or want to take a little bit or preserve a little bit in terms of finding something that's going to be a little bit slower growth in healthcare costs and changing the system.
And Bobby, what about you? What would you like to ask in addition to this big trove of data you have now?
One of the questions that I ask when I'm out in the community and doing meetings is if people understand what the graduation rate means. And here's what I mean by that, and I don't think there's a great understanding of it. Back in the day, which is 12, 15 years ago, the way the graduation rate for high schoolers was determined is you took a high school student who came into high school in September of their senior year, and you measured if they graduated 9 months later. Portland Public Schools was at the cutting edge of changing that measure with the Portland Schools Foundation, now all hands raised, where we now look at a 4-year cohort model. So what we look at is a kid coming into 9th grade in September, and do they graduate 4 years later? And it's a much more honest assessment of how kids are doing, because if you make it to September of your senior year, you're probably going to make it through, and your graduation rate's probably going to look like 80 or 90%, and that's what everybody is so shocked at now when they hear what the real graduation rate is. So the real graduation rate tells us that we lose a whole lot of kids in 9th and 10th and 11th grade. A lot of them are kids who have been historically underserved over the years. A lot of them are our English language learners who just get incredibly frustrated. And so it's important for people to understand what the new measurement is and all of the different intensive interventions that we can put in place if we're having an honest conversation. And those start at kindergarten and before kindergarten and work their way up through the system. 13 years later, you see some results.
Bobby Regan, John McConnell, and Adam Davis, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bobby Regan is Secretary-Treasurer of the Oregon School Board Association. Adam Davis, founder and principal of DHM Research. John McConnell is Director of the Center for Health Systems Effectiveness at Oregon Health and Science University. Mark your calendars for a few shows for next week. Tuesday, it's an hour with the legendary novelist Salman Rushdie. We have a few tickets left. Go to our Facebook page, Think Out Loud OPB, to reserve yours. Friday, we're going to be talking with Malcolm Gladwell. Thanks very much for tuning in today. I'm Dave Miller. Have a great weekend.